Maximus to the Vandal prince Huneric. This wedding had not yet taken place, but neither had it ever been called off. Maximus obviously thought that with Valentinian dead, he could start rearranging dynastic marriages as he saw fit. But, well, King Genseric did not take kindly to the change in plans. After all, he was about to marry his son into the Roman imperial family, and that is not something you just let slip away. So how did Genseric find out that the engagement was cancelled, and that Eudoxia was going to be married off to some usurping senator's son? He was alerted by the mother of the bride and recently widowed Licinia Eudoxia. She knew darn well that Maximus had killed her husband, and so, taking a page from the playbook of her, let's see, what would she be, cousin/sister-in-law Honoria, Licinia Eudoxia wrote a letter to Genseric begging the Vandals to come save her and her family from the brute Maximus. When this letter arrived, Genseric blew his top and mustered an invasion force almost immediately. Whoever this Maximus character was, he was going to rue the day that he had messed with the Vandals. Back in Rome, Maximus was settling comfortably into his new role as emperor, ready to enjoy all the powers and luxuries that came with being the supreme leader of a mighty... What's that you say? The Vandals have set sail from North Africa? Really? Well, that can't be good. Where do you suppose they're headed? Oh, they're headed here! Oh my. Well, better call out the legions. What's that? We really don't have any legions anywhere in the area? Well, what should we do? Panic? Yes, let's do that. Let's panic. Knowing that he had nothing even close to enough troops to fight the Vandals, and that it was almost guaranteed that someone would eventually betray Rome to the barbarians to save their own skin, Maximus told the frightened citizens of the city to just make a run for it. The Vandals are coming. I can't stop them. Best to just literally head for the hills and wait until they're gone. The citizens of Rome took Maximus's advice and began pouring out of the Eternal City. But before they left, they decided that it really wouldn't be right to just let Maximus off the hook for provoking a Vandal invasion like that. There are a couple of different versions of the story, but basically, as the Emperor was preparing to make his own escape, he was tracked down by a mob, stoned to death, torn limb from limb, and then had his bits and pieces thrown into the Tiber. He was about 60 years old, and had called himself Emperor for 2.5 months. 3 days after Maximus was consumed by this angry mob, the Vandals arrived on the Italian coast and marched on Rome. No one stood in their way. The gates of the city were not even locked. Genseric entered Rome and commenced with a good and proper sacking. Now there's some controversy about when the sack actually took place, with some sources saying late May, others saying early June, while still others say that it wasn't until August. But the sources generally agree that Maximus did not reign for more than 3 months, that Valentinian III died in March, and that Maximus died before the Vandals arrived. So I'm not sure where the August date is coming from. But other than that, I don't think that we can be so confident in our sources that we can just definitively say, no, it was on June the 2nd, 455 AD. So when you're asked on the test, when did the Vandals sack Rome? All you need to put is 455. Half credit if you say after the Goths sacked Rome, quarter no credit if you ask what a Vandal is, negative credit if you ask what a Rome is. Like the Gothic sack 45 years earlier, the Vandal sack turned out to not be all that we have been led to believe that it was. Yes, the Vandals occupied the city for 2 weeks, and yes, they carted off most of the treasure the Goths had not already carted off, but it was not mindlessly terrorizing and destructive. Archaeologists sifting through the layers of Rome haven't really found anything that points to a widespread, general destruction of the city in the 5th century, and they actually have ways of determining these sorts of things using, like, science. This conclusion jibes with the stories about Pope Leo I, soon enough to be known as Leo the Great for obvious reasons, convincing Genseric to forego putting Rome to the torch and instead limit himself to simple plundering. Genseric was either swayed by the Pope or was already planning on limiting the scope of his conquest, and so, unlike the Huns at Aquileia, when the Vandals withdrew from Rome 2 weeks later, it still stood. But that did not mean that they did not strip the city bare. Sources mention that not only was all the treasure Titus and Vespasian had brought back from Judea hauled off, but half the roof of the Temple of Jupiter was too. As controlled as the sack was, though, it did not stop the word vandal from entering our lexicon as one who willfully or ignorantly destroys, damages, or defaces property belonging to another or to the public. Since the ancient world is absolutely riddled with Romans and barbarians alike willfully destroying each other's property, it's kind of unfair to saddle the Vandals with this kind of denotative baggage. But on the other hand, I imagine they'd be happier about it than what happened to the poor Goths, a proud nation of noble warriors, whose name now inexplicably means vampire-loving sad sack. When the Vandals withdrew from Rome and sailed back to North Africa, they also took with them the greatest prize of all, and the prize that they had come for in the first place. The Augusta, Licinia Eudoxia, and her 2 daughters, Eudoxia the Younger and Placidia. The 3 imperial women would be held by the Vandals as extremely well-treated prisoners for the next 7 years, and the marriage of Huneric and Eudoxia took place as scheduled. The union produced the future Vandal king Hilderic, who had both Vandal and Theodosian royal blood running through his veins, and who would make for a very controversial figure in the 6th century, and thus, sadly beyond our scope. But more important than what they took with them is what the Vandals left behind, namely, a psychologically scarred Roman population and an imperial power vacuum. Since Maximus's death, no one was technically in charge of the Western Empire, and with Rome reeling from the invasion, it did not look like either the Senate or the Italian armed forces were going to get their act together anytime soon to nominate a new candidate for the job. Which brings us to Eparchius Avitus, the Gallo-Roman senator who has been popping up off and on over the past 25 years, usually when it comes time to broker some kind of deal between Rome and the Goths, which is exactly why he is popping up now. After becoming emperor, Maximus wanted to make sure that the Goths would back him, and so he promoted Avitus to Magister Militum of Gaul and asked him to please arrange Gothic support for the new regime. But since Maximus was only emperor for 2 months before the sack of Rome, that meant that Avitus was just barely getting started when the news came that Maximus was dead. So, who is emperor now? Asked the Goth king Theodoric II, who, by the way, had risen to power after killing his older brother Thorismund following the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields in 453. Well, I'm not really sure, replied Avitus. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Why wait? Asked Theodoric. You're rich, you're in control of the Gallic legions, and you know we support you 150%, so why don't you just become emperor? When he did the math, Avitus realized that Theodoric had a point. With the Goths staunchly in his corner, he almost certainly commanded the largest military force in the Western Empire. So the question wasn't why, it was why not? So, accompanied by a Gothic army, Avitus traveled down to Arles and announced to the Gallic Provincial Council that he was willing to take power if they wanted him to. And they wanted him to. Getting one of their own in power was a hugely appealing prospect. They proclaimed Avitus Augustus on July the 9th, 455 AD. The new, self-proclaimed, by default, whatever, emperor spent the next 3 months consolidating his power base in Gaul before he moved over the Alps in September and entered Italy before winter set in. In a bit of a pleasant throwback to the good old days, though, Avitus did not head straight for Ravenna. Instead, he merely dispatched a Gothic garrison to go hold the city in his name, while he himself continued on to Rome. Maybe it was the political circumstances of the moment that drove his decision. Maximus's reign, brief as it had been based there, and the city had just been sacked and needed a psychological boost. But Avitus clearly felt the need to be in Rome, rather than the now imperial capital of Ravenna, which, like I say, is a pleasant throwback to the good old days. But though Avitus had as good a claim to any to imperial power, that did not mean that he was the only interested party in who should rule the West. Ralph Matheson of the University of South Carolina identifies at least 4 other such interested parties: the Eastern Emperor Marcian, the Italian nobility, the just-departed Vandals, and the leaders of the Italian armed forces. Majorian and his Germanic colleague/mentor, all of them could be theoretically induced to follow Avitus if he played his cards just right. Unfortunately, he would not play his cards just right. Not because he was a bumbling fool or anything, but just that these things are delicate and not a little bit unfair. Avitus started at the top and dispatched envoys to Constantinople seeking recognition for his rule. Either because the Eastern Emperor wanted to appoint his own man, or because he wasn't sure Avitus would survive and didn't want to put his own prestige on the line, Marcian was non-committal about backing Avitus. Well, okay, thought Avitus, no matter, he'll come around. He next sent envoys to Genseric, attempting to lay down some law. I am not Maximus. I have an army. Don't even think about trying to invade Italy a second time. That sort of thing. Which, of course, Genseric scoffed at. As soon as March rolled around and the Mediterranean was safe for sailing again, the Vandals started raiding the Sicilian coast. But these raids were not all bad for Avitus. With the Vandals once again on the offensive, the new emperor dispatched Ricimer to head up the response. Avitus knew damn well that Ricimer and Majorian represented the greatest threats to his regime. Tying up Ricimer in what was sure to be a protracted conflict on the high seas would give Avitus just the kind of breathing room he needed, which is to say that as long as Ricimer was fighting Vandal pirates, he wasn't fighting Avitus. But this breathing space didn't really do Avitus any good. The political fractures in the West were by now simply too great to overcome. In another era, an emperor reigning from Rome with the backing of troops from Gaul would have raised very few eyebrows. But these days, Avitus and the Goths were seen just as much foreign occupiers as Genseric and the Vandals had been. And this was exacerbated because though the Goths supported Avitus, there was a certain implied quid pro quo that the new emperor could not ignore. So as the citizens of Rome took stock of the damage done by the Vandals, they were mighty annoyed to find Avitus siphoning off what little wealth was left and using it to pay his Gothic supporters. From his perspective, Avitus was simply using his imperial authority to pay soldiers in the employ of the empire. But to the Italians, it looked a lot like he was finishing what the Vandals had started. Discontentment spread, and then, to make matters worse, famine once again reared its ugly head. Avitus was blamed for the grain shortages, even though there was little he could do about it. By the autumn of 456,